So my new book is called Unmentionables. It's a history of class, capitalism, and labor in the early Arab American diaspora, really everything up until 1934. I focus on a few tens of thousands of Syrians, Lebanese, and Palestinian immigrants who worked in the woolens, linens, silks, and garment work industries across the northern Atlantic world before 1934. So I came to this project actually, it was during my dissertation, much like Ian described, via an individual life history that I read about in graduate school many years ago. I was researching a dissertation, which would become my first book, on Arab American print culture. I was actually interested in diasporic nationalism at that time during the First World War. But I read about a young man called John Ramey, who was a teenager who lived in Lawrence, Massachusetts, and who was violently bayoneted to death at the famous Bread and Roses strike of 1912. It seemed as though everywhere I read about Middle Eastern workers in America, John Ramey was present. There were multiple versions of his story that sort of iterated through the archives, but the gist of the story goes like this. John was a teenager from Mount Lebanon. He came to Massachusetts with his family around the year 1910. He was part of a community in Lawrence that was about 5,000 Arab American textile workers and the second largest Arab American community in the United States. He worked with the American Woolen Company, which was the firm that employed both of his parents as well as all of his cousins. In January 1912, John went on strike with over 30,000 AWC workers led by the Industrial Workers of the World Union. This strike famously shut down the city of Lawrence for 8 weeks in 1912. Officials responded to pickets and to open worker resistance and rebellion against the police by dispatching the state guard, militiamen who then installed checkpoints into the immigrant neighborhoods and imposed summary curfews on Arab workers specifically. John was part of a group that was defying these curfews and leading daily protest marches into the vicinity of the AWC mill buildings. And it was during one of these protests on January 30th that he was fatally bayoneted by a guardsman. John was one of three young men who was killed at the Bread and Roses strike, and his death became a central turning point in this labor action, the Bread and Roses strike, which historians now credit with making the American working class. And so everywhere that one reads about early Arab American labor history, this is a story you hear. You hear about John Ramey. He's one of a very small cluster of sort of known Arab American labor organizers. And it was actually his death that made him into kind of an icon for Arab American labor in this diaspora. Beyond his story, though, a strange thing happens in the archives of Arab Americana. Like other Asian diasporas, there was a deep tradition of counter-archival practices in the Arab American context. Historians who work on this topic usually work with print culture, newspapers, serials, small-run books, personal histories, family papers, or other kinds of socially produced, community-curated texts. And the result of this kind of counter-archival activity is the reproduction of certain iconic sorts of historical narration. And of course, coming with that, the marginalization of others. What I'm saying is that certain main characters emerge in these archives, and Ramey is one of them. One of the other most famous main characters in Arab American history is the Syrian American merchant peddler. Syrian peddlers also appear everywhere in histories of this diaspora. When peddler stories are read through the immigration counter archives that most of us use in this topic, the vision that we get of Arab immigration to the United States is that it's a commercial immigration, that this is a history of merchants and not workers, that this is a diaspora which has a commercial past but lacks an industrial history. And so this larger context is part of why I find John Ramey's story really interesting and wanted to write a book about him. It also helps us understand why his story is told in the ways that it is and why his story is selected and others are not, right? John's story individualizes him. It masculinizes the history of Arab American labor. And even though print culture talks about John and his death, the same Arab American print culture doesn't necessarily acknowledge labor strikes, trade unionism, collective action, or connections to the radical wing of America's labor movement. The historiography arising from these archives tends to discount the presence of Arab American women on picket lines more generally. Instead, the era's print culture curated certain narratives about Arab American racial respectability, narratives that really set this notion of like racial progress through commerce and entrepreneurialism. And so the immigration counter archives, in other words, capture the history of this industry, the textile industry, but they tend to do so from the perspective of the diaspora's capitalist classes. Contests over working conditions, labor strikes, even confrontations with the cops, they were clearly seen and heard at the time, but they were unmentionable in these archives. Noticing these silences in the archives that I've worked pretty closely with now for a while, the current culture also formed the basis for my first book. I endeavored to write a history of class, capitalism, and workers in this diaspora. My research method is pretty simple. I look for work. Sorry for the pun, but it is a pun that I use in the book. And I narrate the experience of Arab workers, focusing particularly on labor activism as well as mutual aid politics, which supported and sustained these working communities. I started the book, honestly, hoping to write a radical history like a workers of the world style labor history, focused substantially on Arab American workers in the United States. However, that's not exactly what emerged. That's not exactly what Unmentionables does in the end. What I discovered instead was that there was an entire labor economy in not just the Arab American context, but the Arab Atlantic context, this entire diaspora. This labor economy joined Arab workers and the factories which employed them in the United States, as well as parts of Mexico and Latin America. Interestingly, the Northern Atlantic islands like Madeira or the Azores, which are also one of the chapters in the book, and factories which were emerging in the Middle East, both before and after the First World War. The textile industry linked all of these production zones together in this key period between 1900 and 1920. And an assortment of transnational Arab textile firms were sort of integrating the sourcing of raw threads, the spinning and weaving of cloth bolts, and then the cutting, stitching, the embroidering of these textiles into garments, household textiles, and generalized white goods. Most of the goods that were produced in these factories were undergarments, things like underwear, stockings, cuffs and collar sets, and most famously, a house dress that is known as the Syrian kimono, which was a collarless robe printed in florals and produced principally by the Syrian community in New York City. And so my book gets its title, Unmentionables, from the colloquial term that Americans called these undergarments at the time. But I'm also largely concerned with the way that ethnic and cultural politics made certain kinds of industrial labor, especially industrial labor by women and girls, unmentionable more broadly. So the book's general arc reconstructs the transnational supply chains of the Arab Atlantic. There are 5 chapters that move from labor migration to spinning and weaving, and from there to the garment factories where these goods were produced. These early chapters are really focused centrally on New York City and New England, and they tell the labor history of Arab Americans in the textile industry, as well as their connections with the socialist and radical wings of American labor movements. Then the book proceeds along the supply chain. In a chapter on Syrian American outsourcing of factories, I discuss how Syrian American firms centered in New York City purchased the entire linen embroidery industry on the northern Atlantic Portuguese island of Madeira in 1916. They did so because they were responding to a series of ILGWU strikes, which had shut down the New York City white goods industry that year. And so these Syrian firms were purchasing factories abroad to continue feeding global markets. This had the consequence of monopolizing the global white goods market. It also shaped how Madeiran labor organizers operated in the 1920s in response to the new Syrian shops. Spoiler alert, the Syrian factories of Madeira were credibly accused of illegal price controls, and their managers were literally expelled, literally deported from the island in 1925. Next, the book concludes with a chapter which reframes that iconic Syrian peddler, reframes the peddler not necessarily as a merchant in miniature, as he's commonly celebrated by the historiography, but stages him as a textile worker, as a person who is essentially working in last mile logistics at the employ of some of these textile firms in the 1920s. That chapter focuses on how Syrian American peddlers operated in one of the most significant commercial zones of the 1920s, which is the US borderlands with Mexico. All in all, my book seeks to pluralize the study of Arab American labor history by focusing on narrators who have been missing from the historiography until now. Along the way, I make not so much a critique of the counter archives as source for immigration history, because I'm not exactly interested in critiquing the viability of counter archives, but I'm making an argument that immigration counter archives, community records, are also shot through with class, gender, and racial politics. And this means we can query them on the path towards a critical Arab American history.